Have you ever considered that the very blood coursing through your veins, the fluid that sustains your heartbeat and fuels your thoughts, is being meticulously tasted and retasted every single minute by a pair of silent bean-shaped guardians? Imagine for a moment that your body is a vast, thriving city, and within the city, there is an ancient and highly sophisticated library. This library doesn't house books, but rather the chemical blueprints of your existence. To keep the city running, the library must remain perfectly balanced. If the ink becomes too acidic or the parchment too damp, the records of your life begin to fade. We often take for granted the simple act of hydration or the meals we consume. Yet there is a system working tirelessly beneath the surface to ensure that every drop of your internal sea remains pure. This is the urinary system, a masterwork of biological engineering that serves as the body's dedicated chemist, filtration suite, and regulator of life. Tonight, we will peel back the layers of our everyday experience to look at the broad landscape of this system, exploring how it maintains the delicate architecture of balance that allows you to rest in peace. Lesson 1. Overview of the urinary system. To truly understand the urinary system, we must first embrace a fundamental biological concept known as homeostasis. Homeostasis is the body's relentless drive to maintain a stable internal environment, regardless of the chaos occurring in the world outside. You might think of it as a rhythmic, steady pulse that keeps your internal chemistry within a very narrow, safe range. The urinary system is the primary architect of this stability. It does far more than simply produce waste. It acts as a discerning gatekeeper, constantly monitoring the volume, pressure, and chemical composition of your blood. At the center of this vital operation are the two kidneys. You might picture these organs as two resilient sentinels, each roughly the size of a large fist, tucked safely against the back wall of your abdominal cavity. They are the workhorses of the system, receiving a massive and constant flow of blood directly from the heart. Their primary task is to sift through this blood, identifying what is essential to keep and what is superfluous to discard. If you have ever watched a professional archivist meticulously sorting through thousands of documents, keeping every important record while setting aside only the unnecessary scraps, you have a glimpse into the daily life of a kidney. From the kidneys, the journey of the fluid continues through the ureters. These are two slender muscular tubes that serve as the quiet corridors of the urinary system. It is a common misconception to think of the ureters as simple, passive pipes through which fluid merely falls due to gravity. In reality, they are living conduits that use a process called peristalsis. This involves rhythmic, wave-like contractions of the smooth muscle within their walls, which milks the fluid downward towards the next station. This active transport is essential. It ensures that the journey of the fluid remains unidirectional and constant, even when you are lying down or changing positions during sleep. The path eventually leads to the urinary bladder, a remarkable and highly expandable reservoir. The bladder is a hollow, muscular organ designed specifically for the temporary storage of fluid until the body determines it is an appropriate and convenient time for release. Its beauty lies in its elasticity. Its walls are composed of specialized tissue that can stretch and unfold as it fills, and then contract with significant force when it is time to empty. Finally, we encounter the urethra, the thin final tube that serves as the exit pathway to the outside world. This four-part architecture, the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra, forms the physical framework of the system. Each part is logically connected to the next, creating a seamless flow from the microscopic filtration of blood to the macroscopic elimination of waste. Take a moment to let that idea find its place. And your body doesn't just filter in the way a mechanical sieve might. Instead, it employs a bold and energetic philosophy. The kidneys essentially dump out a huge portion of the blood's water and small dissolved particles into a specialized set of microscopic tubes. Then they spend the rest of the process carefully picking back up exactly what the body needs: the glucose, the vital salts, the amino acids, and the majority of the water. This ensures that even unknown toxins, substances your body may have never encountered before, are naturally excluded because the body simply forgets to pick them back up. It is a system of profound wisdom and inherent safety, prioritizing the preservation of life-sustaining elements over the mere removal of waste. As we delve deeper into the significance of these organs, and we can appreciate the history of how we came to understand their brilliance. In the 2nd century, the Greek physician Galen was one of the first to correctly identify that urine was produced in the kidneys and transported to the bladder, rather than being concocted by the bladder itself. Since those early observations, we have discovered that the kidneys are situated in a very specific anatomical niche called the retroperitoneal space. If you imagine your abdominal organs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, all wrapped in a protective silky bag called the peritoneum, the kidneys actually sit behind that bag. They are nestled firmly against the deep muscles of your back and are protected by the lower rib cage. This unique positioning provides them with a stable, protected environment and buffered from the constant movements of the digestive tract. Furthermore, each kidney is capped by a small triangular gland known as the adrenal gland. While these glands are part of the endocrine system, their proximity to the kidneys is a testament to the integrated nature of our biology. They produce hormones that tell the kidneys exactly how much salt and water to retain or release. To grasp the sheer scale of the kidneys' work, consider the volume of blood they process. Every single minute, about 20 to 25% of the total blood pumped by your heart is sent directly to your kidneys. This is an astounding amount of attention for two organs that make up less than 1% of your total body weight. They are constantly tasting the blood, checking for the concentration of electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and calcium. If there is too much sodium in your system, perhaps from a savory meal, the kidneys quietly escort the excess out. If there is too little, they hold on to every single grain with incredible tenacity. Beyond salt and water, the kidneys are the primary guardians of your blood's pH balance. Your blood must stay slightly alkaline, within a very narrow and specific range. If it becomes even slightly too acidic, it can disrupt every enzyme and cellular process in your body. The kidneys respond by excreting hydrogen ions and regenerating bicarbonate, acting as a slow but incredibly powerful buffer system. It is the steady hand on the tiller of your biological ship, ensuring you don't veer off course into chemical toxicity. If your mind is still following along, try visualizing the kidneys as endocrine organs as well. They produce a hormone called erythropoietin, often abbreviated as EPO. When the kidneys detect that the oxygen levels in your blood are beginning to dip, they release EPO, which travels through your circulation to your bone marrow, signaling it to produce more red blood cells. In this way, your kidneys are the reason you can adapt to high altitudes and ensure your tissues always have the oxygen they need to thrive. They also perform the final, critical step in activating vitamin D, turning it into a form your body can actually use to absorb calcium and keep your bones strong. No organ is an island. The urinary system is in constant vital conversation with the heart, the lungs, the bones, and the brain. The reason this foundational knowledge is so important is that the urinary system is the silent reason you can exist in a constantly changing world. Consider the simple act of eating a salty meal or drinking a large glass of water. Without the urinary system, these everyday actions would cause your blood pressure to spike or your internal chemistry to spiral out of control. It is the system that allows you to remain you, regardless of what you consume. When you go for a long walk on a warm afternoon and forget your water bottle, it is your kidneys that step in to recycle your internal water. They produce a highly concentrated urine, saving as much fluid as possible to ensure your brain and heart remain hydrated. Conversely, if you drink an abundance of tea or water, the kidneys recognize the excess and allow it to pass through, now preventing your tissues from becoming waterlogged. This is the principle that explains why your blood pressure remains stable and why your metabolic trash is cleared out before it can do harm. So you see, this isn't just a theory in a textbook or a dry list of anatomical parts. It is the principle that explains the strength of your skeleton, the clarity of your blood, and the resilience of your life. This system is a master of multitasking, a quiet technician working in the background while you sleep to make sure every other system has the clean, balanced environment it needs to function. It is the ultimate expression of the body's desire to maintain order in the face of chaos. Don't worry about memorizing every hormone or every anatomical layer tonight. Just let the logic of this immense filtration and regulation process wash over you. Your body is a masterpiece of coordination, and the urinary system is its most dedicated guardian. We have spent our time tonight looking at the urinary system from a distance, appreciating the four main organs and the vital roles they play in keeping us alive and balanced. We have seen that the kidneys are the thinkers and the chemists. The ureters are the rhythmic transporters. The bladder is the resilient storer, and the urethra is the final gatekeeper. We have seen how they work together to protect the internal sea that bathes every cell in your body. However, to truly appreciate the genius of this design, we must eventually look closer. We have to understand how these organs are built, layer by layer. To facilitate such intense filtration and movement, we need to see how the blood actually enters the kidney and where it goes once it is inside. We need to look at the distinct regions, the cortex, the medulla, and the pelvis, that allow the kidney to perform its chemical magic with such efficiency. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. Our next lesson will hand us the adjacent piece, which is a closer look at the physical architecture of the kidney itself. We will move from the where and the why to the how, exploring the structures that the naked eye can see before we eventually shrink down to the microscopic level. This is a good place to rest your thoughts for a moment before we continue our journey into the architecture of your body. Lesson 2. Gross anatomy of the kidney. Tonight, we move from the abstract understanding of the urinary system's purpose and begin to examine the physical vessel that makes such chemistry possible. Imagine, if you will, that we are shrinking our perspective, moving closer to the small of your back to witness the architecture of the kidney. This is a study of gross anatomy, which simply means the structures we can see with the naked eye. It is the study of form following function. Every curve, every layer, and every vessel in the kidney is positioned with a deliberate evolutionary precision. As we explore the kidney's exterior protection and its interior landscape, I want you to visualize it not as a static organ in a textbook, but as a living, pulsating masterpiece of biological engineering. We will walk through the layers of protection that keep these vital organs safe. And then we will peel back those layers to explore the hidden chambers where the blood is refined. This is the next natural step in our journey, understanding the house before we meet the workers inside. To begin our tour of the kidney's anatomy, we must first locate where these organs sit within your body. Most people assume the kidneys are deep within the belly, but they are actually quite shy organs. They reside in what we call the retroperitoneal position. If you picture the transparent, protective lining of your abdominal cavity, the peritoneum, the kidneys are tucked behind it, right against the strong muscles of your back. They sit on either side of your vertebral column, roughly between the level of the T12 thoracic vertebra and the L3 lumbar vertebra. Interestingly, they are not perfectly symmetrical in their height. Because the liver is such a large and heavy organ on your right side, it nudges the right kidney slightly lower than the left. The kidney itself is a sturdy, bean-shaped organ with a dark, reddish-brown hue. Its outer surface is not exposed directly to the other organs. Instead, it is wrapped in 3 distinct layers of packaging that provide both physical protection and biological insulation. The innermost layer is the renal capsule. This is a smooth, transparent, and remarkably tough sheet of fibrous connective tissue. You might think of it like a form-fitting rain jacket or the skin of a drum. Yeah, its primary job is to provide a barrier against physical trauma and to prevent infections from nearby organs from reaching the delicate inner tissues of the kidney. Just outside the capsule lies the second layer, known as the perirenal fat capsule. This is a thick cushion of adipose tissue, essentially a layer of packing peanuts. This fat is vital because it holds the kidneys in place against the back wall and protects them from the jolts and jars of your daily movements. Finally, the outermost layer is the renal fascia, a thin but strong layer of dense connective tissue that anchors the kidney and the adrenal gland to the surrounding structures. When we look at the kidney from the side, we notice a deep indentation on the medial or inward-facing curve. This is called the renal hilum. You can think of the hilum as the grand entrance or the main port of call for the kidney. It is through this vertical cleft that the renal artery enters, bringing oxygenated but unfiltered blood, and the renal vein exits, carrying away the cleaned blood. It is also the exit point for the ureter, which carries the finished urine down to the bladder, and the entry point for various nerves and lymphatic vessels. If we were to take a sharp blade and slice the kidney in half lengthwise, we would reveal a beautiful tiered internal landscape. The interior of the kidney is divided into three major regions. The outermost region, directly beneath the renal capsule, is the renal cortex. The word cortex comes from the Latin for bark, and much like the bark of a tree, it forms a protective and functional outer layer. In a healthy kidney, the cortex is light-colored and has a slightly granular appearance. Deep to the cortex is the renal medulla. This is a much darker reddish-brown region that contains several cone-shaped tissue masses called renal pyramids. The broad base of each pyramid faces toward the cortex, while its pointed tip, or apex, points toward the center of the kidney. These tips are known as renal papillae. Between these pyramids, we see extensions of the cortical tissue that reach down into the medulla. These are called renal columns. They act as structural dividers and provide a pathway for blood vessels to travel deep into the organ. Finally, we find the renal pelvis. This is a flat, funnel-shaped tube that is continuous with the ureter leaving the hilum. The pelvis is the central collecting basin. Before urine enters the pelvis, it is gathered by small, cup-like structures called minor calyces, which enclose the papillae of the pyramids. Several minor calyces join together to form major calyces, which then empty into the renal pelvis. It is a system of ever-widening streams that eventually form a single river leading out of the kidney. The internal structure of the kidney is not just a map of storage areas. It is a map of a massive river system of blood. Because the kidney's primary job is to filter the blood, its vascular anatomy is incredibly complex. To appreciate this, we must follow the path of the blood as it enters the hilum. The renal artery, which is a direct and large branch of the abdominal aorta, enters the kidney and immediately begins to divide. It splits into segmental arteries, which then branch further into interlobar arteries that travel up through the renal columns between the pyramids. As these vessels reach the boundary between the medulla and the cortex, they arch over the bases of the pyramids, becoming the arcuate arteries. From there, small cortical radiate arteries branch off to supply the cortical tissue where the actual filtration begins. This branching pattern ensures that every square millimeter of the kidney receives a high-pressure, high-volume supply of blood. This is why the kidney is so sensitive to changes in blood pressure. The very architecture of the organ is designed to harness that pressure for filtration. Historically, our understanding of this intricate branching was significantly advanced by the work of Marcello Malpighi in the 17th century. And he was one of the first scientists to use the newly invented microscope to look at the kidneys. And he described the tiny corpuscles in the cortex that we now know are the starting points of the nephrons. Later, in the 19th century, the French anatomist Henry J. Bertin gave his name to the renal columns of Bertin, those pillars of cortex that dip into the medulla. These pioneers looked at the same structures we are discussing tonight, marveling at how such a small organ could be so densely packed with complex pathways. Consider the significance of the renal pyramids within the medulla. Each kidney typically contains between 8 and 18 of these pyramids. They are not solid masses, but are actually composed of thousands of microscopic collecting ducts and tubules. The striated or lined appearance you see in a pyramid is caused by these tubules running in parallel towards the papilla. This arrangement is essential for the kidney's ability to concentrate urine. By keeping these tubules tightly packed and aligned, the kidney can create a concentration gradient, a saltiness that increases as you move deeper into the medulla. This gradient is the engine that pulls water out of the urine and back into the body when you are dehydrated. Without the specific geometric arrangement of the pyramids, we would not be able to conserve water effectively. The renal pelvis and the calyces are also more than just passive drains. They are lined with smooth muscle that contracts rhythmically. This means that as soon as a drop of urine drips from a renal papilla into a minor calyx, it is actively propelled forward. The kidney does not wait for gravity to do the work. It uses its own muscular walls to move the fluid toward the ureter. This is why the renal pelvis is often described as a dynamic basin. It is the final transition point where the microscopic work of the cortex and medulla becomes the macroscopic reality of urine storage and excretion. Understanding this gross anatomy is not just an academic exercise. It has profound implications for how we understand health and disease. For instance, consider the common and painful occurrence of kidney stones or renal calculi. These stones usually form in the renal pelvis or the calyces when certain salts and minerals in the urine crystallize. Because we know the anatomy of the renal pelvis and the narrowness of the ureter as it leaves the hilum, we can understand exactly why these stones cause such intense pain. They often get lodged in the narrow funnel of the pelvis or at the points where the ureter kinks. Knowing the plumbing of the kidney allows doctors to use sound waves to break these stones into smaller pieces that can pass through the narrow calyces. Furthermore, the protective layers we discussed, the fat and the fascia, are why you can play sports or go about your day without damaging these delicate filters. However, in cases of extreme and rapid weight loss, that perirenal fat capsule can sometimes shrink so much that the kidney actually drops to a lower position. This is a condition called nephroptosis. Because the ureter is anchored, a dropping kidney can cause the ureter to kink like a garden hose, leading to a backup of urine and a dangerous increase in internal pressure called hydronephrosis. This illustrates how vital the external packing material is to the function of the internal structures. So you see, the physical form of the kidney, its location behind the peritoneum, its protective fat, its division into cortex and medulla, and its funnel-like pelvis, is all a single, unified design for efficiency. The kidney is built to receive blood at high pressure, sort through it in a specialized garden, the cortex, concentrate the waste in structured cones, the medulla, and drain it all into a central basin, the pelvis. Every piece of the puzzle we have discussed tonight fits perfectly into the next. Take a moment to let the logic of this architecture find its place in your mind. If your mind is still following along, try visualizing the blood as a wide, rushing river entering the hilum, branching into thousands of smaller streams in the cortex, and then finally dripping as refined urine into the quiet, dark basin of the renal pelvis. It is a journey of purification that happens in the space of just a few inches. Having now grasped the physical structure and the grand stadium of the kidney, we are perfectly prepared to appreciate its function. We have seen the cortex, the medulla, and the pyramids from the outside, but we have not yet looked at the individual workers that populate these regions. The gross anatomy provides the map, but the microscopic anatomy provides the action. To understand how the blood is actually filtered, how the keep pile is separated from the discard pile, we must go smaller. We must move beyond what the naked eye can see and explore the million or so microscopic functional units that inhabit the cortex and medulla. These are the nephrons, and they are where the true miracle of the urinary system occurs. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. We have explored the house. Now it is time to meet the inhabitants. Our next lesson will take us into the microscopic world, where we will study the anatomy and the incredible variety of the nephron. This is a good place to rest your thoughts for a moment before we continue our journey into the invisible workings of your body. Lesson 3. The nephron, the functional unit. In our previous explorations, we have stood back and marveled at the kidney as a whole, a sturdy bean-shaped guardian tucked away in the retroperitoneal space. We have traced the major blood vessels and mapped out the grand chambers of the cortex and the medulla. But now, my friend, we must change our perspective entirely. To truly understand how the body maintains its internal sea, we must leave the world of the visible and enter the world of the microscopic. We are going to explore the nephron. If the kidney is a great city, the nephron is the individual household where all the vital work is done. There are over 1 million of these tiny, intricate structures in each of your kidneys, and together, they are responsible for every drop of urine you produce and every chemical adjustment your blood requires. Tonight, we will look at the anatomy of this functional unit, from the high-pressure filter of the renal corpuscle to the winding, sophisticated journey of the renal tubule. It is here, in these invisible corridors, that the logic of life is most clearly written. Let us move forward with patience and wonder as we meet the microscopic workers of the renal system. To visualize a nephron, imagine a very long, very thin tube that is closed at one end and highly coiled along its path. It is not just a pipe, but a sophisticated processing plant. Every nephron consists of 2 primary parts: the renal corpuscle, where the blood is first filtered, and the renal tubule, where that filtered fluid is refined into its final form. Our journey begins at the renal corpuscle, which is always located in the renal cortex. This structure is the starting gate. It consists of a tuft of capillaries called the glomerulus, which is nestled inside a cup-shaped hollow structure known as the glomerular capsule, or more traditionally, Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus is unique among the body's capillaries because it is fed and drained by arterioles, high-pressure vessels, rather than a vein. This high pressure is the physical engine that forces fluid out of the blood and into the capsule. Once the fluid, now called filtrate, leaves the capsule, it enters the renal tubule. This tubule is roughly 3 centimeters long, which may sound small until you realize there are millions of them, creating a total length of over 50 miles of tubing within your 2 kidneys. The tubule is divided into 3 major sections based on their shape and position. First is the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT. The word convoluted simply means coiled or twisted, and this section is a tangled masterpiece of loops. Because it is the first stop after filtration, it is lined with specialized cells that have a brush border of microvilli, vastly increasing the surface area for reabsorbing the treasures, like glucose and water, back into the blood. Next, the tubule straightens out and dives deep into the renal medulla, forming a sharp U-turn known as the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle. This loop has a descending limb that heads toward the salty depths of the medulla, and an ascending limb that climbs back up toward the cortex. The thickness of the walls changes as it moves, which is a structural clue to the different jobs each part of the loop performs. Finally, the tubule becomes coiled again as the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, before emptying into a collecting duct, while the collecting duct receives fluid from many different nephrons. It is the final corridor where the body makes its last-minute decisions about water balance. The history of the nephron is a testament to the power of human curiosity and the evolution of the microscope. In the mid-19th century, a young British surgeon and anatomist named William Bowman spent countless hours peering through early lenses at thin slices of kidney tissue. In 1842, he published his landmark discovery of the capsule that now bears his name, and he was the first to realize that the corpuscles previously described by Malpighi were actually the connection points between the blood system and the urinary system. A few years later, the German anatomist Friedrich Henle identified the long looping section of the tubule that dives into the medulla. These men didn't just see structures. They intuited the why behind them, realizing that the long, winding path of the tubule provided the time and space necessary for the body to reclaim its vital resources. If we look even closer at the renal corpuscle, we see a level of design that is truly breathtaking. The inner layer of Bowman's capsule is made of highly specialized cells called podocytes. These cells have long, finger-like extensions called foot processes that wrap around the glomerular capillaries. Between these fingers are tiny slits called filtration slits. This creates a physical sieve so fine that it allows water and small solids to pass through while keeping your precious blood cells and large proteins safely inside the vessels. It is a biological filter that never needs to be replaced, functioning tirelessly for a lifetime. It is also important to note that not all nephrons are created equal. About 85% of them are cortical nephrons. As the name suggests, they are located almost entirely within the renal cortex, with only a very short loop that barely dips into the medulla. These are the generalists, handling the bulk of the day-to-day filtration and reabsorption. However, the remaining 15% are the juxtamedullary nephrons. These are located at the very border of the cortex and medulla, and they possess incredibly long loops of Henle that dive deep into the saltiest regions of the renal pyramids. These specialized nephrons are the ones responsible for our ability to produce highly concentrated urine when we are dehydrated, a vital adaptation for survival in environments where water is scarce. Surrounding these tubules is a second, equally important network of capillaries. The peritubular capillaries wrap closely around the PCT and DCT, acting like a magnet to pull reabsorbed substances back into the general circulation. For the long looping juxtamedullary nephrons, these vessels form long, straight bundles called the vasa recta that run parallel to the loop of Henle. This close proximity between the waste tube and the blood tube is what allows for the constant, rapid exchange of chemicals and water that defines renal function. It is a dual-track system where the blood is cleaned and the body is nourished simultaneously. The structure of the nephron explains so much of what we experience in our daily health. For example, consider the way your body responds to certain medications or toxins. Because the nephron is so long and its walls are so thin, it is particularly vulnerable to damage. If the high pressure in the glomerulus becomes too extreme, as it does in chronic high blood pressure, it can actually tear those delicate filtration slits. When this happens, large proteins like albumin can leak through into the urine. This is why a simple urine test for protein is one of the most effective ways to check for early kidney damage. Furthermore, the incredible length of the PCT and its brush border of microvilli is the reason why a healthy person never has sugar in their urine. Your body knows that glucose is a high-energy fuel, so it has built an expansive, efficient reclamation system in the very first part of the tubule. Every single molecule of glucose is caught by those microvilli and pumped back into the peritubular capillaries before it can get more than a few millimeters down the tube. It is only when the blood sugar is so high that it overwhelms these millions of tiny pumps, as happens in untreated diabetes, that glucose finally escapes into the urine. This microscopic architecture also reveals the logic of hydration. When you drink a large amount of water, your juxtamedullary nephrons don't need to work as hard to concentrate the urine. The fluid moves relatively quickly through the loops and collecting ducts, and the gates stay closed, allowing the excess water to stay in the tubule and be flushed away. But when you are thirsty, your body uses hormones to open the gates in the collecting ducts, allowing the high salt environment of the medulla to pull that water back into your blood. This entire life-saving process is only possible because of the specific physical layout of the nephron and its relationship to the surrounding tissue. As you rest tonight, try to visualize this vast silent workforce. Within you, at this very moment, 2 million nephrons are sorting through your blood. They are checking, pumping, filtering, and reclaiming. They are the microscopic architects of your stability. This isn't just a list of parts in a textbook, and it is the living machinery that allows you to exist in a state of balance. The logic of it is simple. The body leaves nothing to chance, creating a long, winding path where every vital resource can be found and brought back home. We have now met the inhabitants of the kidney. We have seen the microscopic world of the nephron, the glomerulus, and the winding tubules that fill the cortex and medulla. You understand the house and the workers, but knowing the anatomy is only the first half of the story. Now, we must witness these workers in action. How does the blood actually turn into that raw fluid inside the capsule? It isn't a magical transformation. It is a process of physics and pressure. It is the first great act of the urinary system's play. In our next session, we will focus specifically on that first moment of creation, the process of glomerular filtration. We will look at the pressures involved, the barriers the fluid must cross, and how the body ensures that the big dump of fluid at the start of the line is handled with precision. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. You have explored the physical unit of life. Next, we will explore its primary function. Rest easy, knowing that while your mind relaxes, these million little factories are continuing their essential work. Lesson 4. Glomerular Filtration. We have reached the first act of our physiological play. In our previous sessions, we walked through the grand halls of the kidney's anatomy and met the microscopic workers known as nephrons. Now, we must witness the very moment urine begins its life. This process is called glomerular filtration. It is the vital, high-pressure event that takes place within the renal corpuscle. where the liquid essence of your blood is separated from its cellular components. Think of this lesson as a study in biological physics. We are going to explore how the body uses the power of the heart, blood pressure, to force fluid through a specialized three-layered sieve. We will learn why some things are allowed to pass into the nephron, while others are strictly forbidden from leaving the bloodstream. There is a beautiful mechanical logic to this process. It is a passive act, meaning it requires no direct energy from the kidney itself. It simply relies on the relentless rhythm of your pulse. As we explore the pressures, the barriers, and the rate of this filtration, I want you to appreciate the sheer scale of this task. Every drop of blood you possess will face this filter dozens of times before the sun rises tomorrow. To understand glomerular filtration, we must look closely at the interface between the circulatory system and the urinary system. This occurs in the renal corpuscle. Inside the cup-shaped Bowman's capsule sits the glomerulus, a tangled knot of capillaries. However, these are not ordinary capillaries. In most of your body, capillaries are low-pressure vessels where oxygen and nutrients slowly leak out to feed the tissues. The glomerulus is different. It is a high-pressure circuit specifically designed for mass-market filtration. The high pressure is created by a simple but brilliant trick of plumbing. The vessel bringing blood into the glomerulus, the afferent arteriole, is significantly wider than the vessel taking blood away, the efferent arteriole. Imagine a large 5-lane highway suddenly narrowing down into a 2-lane bridge. The cars, or in this case the blood, will naturally bunch up and experience increased pressure at that bottleneck. This is the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. This pressure is the primary force that pushes water and small dissolved solutes out of the blood and through the filtration membrane. The filtration membrane itself is a masterwork of selective permeability. It consists of 3 distinct layers that act like increasingly fine sieves. First, the fluid must pass through the fenestrations, or tiny pores, of the capillary endothelium. These pores are large enough to let almost anything liquid pass through, but they are too small for red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets. If your blood cells were allowed to leak out here, you would lose the very foundation of your oxygen transport system. Once past the pores, the fluid meets the basement membrane. This is a gel-like layer of proteins that acts as a physical barrier and a chemical one. Because the basement membrane is negatively charged, it repels most blood proteins, which are also negatively charged. Like 2 magnets of the same pole pushing away from each other, the membrane uses electricity to keep vital proteins like albumin inside the blood. Finally, the fluid passes through the filtration slits of the podocytes, those finger-like cells we met in the last lesson. These slits provide the final quality control check. The resulting fluid that makes it through all 3 layers into the interior of Bowman's capsule is called filtrate. It is important to realize that this filtrate is not yet urine. In fact, it is chemically very similar to blood plasma, minus the large proteins. It contains water, glucose, amino acids, nitrogenous wastes like urea, and a variety of salts and vitamins. At this stage, the kidney has effectively dumped out a massive portion of the blood's contents, trusting that the tubules later in the line will be able to sort the treasure from the trash. The efficiency of this process is measured by a metric known as the Glomerular Filtration Rate, or GFR. In a healthy adult, the GFR is approximately 125 milliliters per minute. If you stop to calculate that, it means your kidneys produce about 180 liters of filtrate every single day. Since the average human only has about 5 liters of blood, your entire blood volume is filtered about 36 times in a 24-hour period. It is a relentless energetic pace that ensures no metabolic toxin can accumulate for long. The history of our understanding of this process is tied to the concept of Starling forces, named after the English physiologist Ernest Starling. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Starling described how different pressures compete at the capillary level. In the glomerulus, it is a tug-of-war between three main forces. We have already mentioned the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which pushes fluid out of the blood. Opposing this is the capsular hydrostatic pressure, which is the back pressure exerted by the fluid already sitting in the capsule, pushing back against the blood. The third player is the colloid osmotic pressure. Because proteins are kept inside the glomerular capillaries, they create an osmotic pull that wants to keep water inside the vessels. For filtration to occur, the outward push-in hydrostatic pressure must be stronger than the combined forces of the inward pushing capsular pressure and the osmotic pull of the proteins. The net result of this competition is the net filtration pressure. It is a delicate balance. If your blood pressure drops too low, the hydrostatic pressure may not be enough to overcome the opposing forces, and filtration, and thus kidney function, can grind to a halt. To prevent this from happening during the normal ups and downs of your day, the kidney possesses a remarkable ability called autoregulation. Even if your systemic blood pressure rises when you are stressed or drops when you are sleeping, the kidney can adjust the diameter of the afferent and efferent arterioles to keep the GFR steady. This is largely handled by the juxtaglomerular apparatus, a specialized group of cells that tastes the salt content of the filtrate further down the tube. If it detects that filtration is moving too fast or too slow, it sends chemical signals to the arterioles to constrict or dilate, maintaining a constant flow. It is as if the filter has its own built-in thermostat, ensuring that the work of purification never wavers, regardless of what the rest of the body is doing. The mechanics of glomerular filtration explain a great deal about clinical medicine and daily health. For example, when a physician orders a blood test to check your creatinine levels, they are essentially checking your GFR. Creatinine is a waste product of muscle metabolism that is filtered by the glomerulus, but not reabsorbed by the tubules. If your kidneys are filtering slowly, creatinine levels in the blood will rise. Thus, blood creatinine serves as a reliable proxy for how well your biological sieves are performing their daily tasks. This process also reveals the danger of chronic high blood pressure, or hypertension. If the pressure in the glomerulus is consistently too high, and it is like trying to use a high-pressure power washer on a delicate window screen. Over time, the intense pressure can damage the basement membrane and the podocytes. When these barriers are compromised, the negative charge is lost, and the filtration slits widen. This leads to proteinuria, where large proteins like albumin leak into the urine. Seeing protein in a urine sample is often the first warning sign that the high-pressure plumbing of the kidney is beginning to fail. Furthermore, the passive nature of filtration explains why staying hydrated is so important. Dehydration can lead to a drop in blood volume and systemic blood pressure. As blood pressure falls, the net filtration pressure in the glomerulus decreases. While autoregulation can compensate for a while, severe dehydration can eventually cause the GFR to plummet and leading to a buildup of urea and other toxins in the blood, a state known as uremia. Your kidneys need that water pressure from your heart to keep the filters running. As you rest tonight, you might visualize this silent, pressurized exchange. Inside your cortex, millions of tiny bottlenecks are creating the force necessary to push your blood through those three delicate layers. The proteins stay behind, the cells stay behind, and a clear, nutrient-rich filtrate begins its long journey through the tubules. It is a process of massive scale, handled with microscopic precision. The big dump has occurred, and the stage is now set for the next phase of the journey. The careful, painstaking process of reclaiming what is valuable. We have now seen the beginning of the urine-making process. We have witnessed the power of the heart and the precision of the filtration membrane. We have 180 liters of filtrate sitting in the millions of Bowman's capsules throughout your kidneys. But as we know, we only excrete about 1 or 2 liters of urine a day. This means that over 99% of that filtrate must be taken back. If we simply let that filtrate leave the body, we would be depleted of our entire water supply and all of our blood sugar in a matter of minutes. The kidney is a master of second thoughts. Now that it has pushed everything out into the tubule, it must immediately begin the work of sorting through the pile to find the gold. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. Having now grasped the mechanics of the outflow, we are perfectly prepared to appreciate the recollection. In our next lesson, we will follow the filtrate into the first section of the tubule to study the massive and energetic process of tubular reabsorption. Lesson 5: Tubular reabsorption. In our last session, we witnessed the dramatic first act of renal function, glomerular filtration. We saw how the high pressure of the blood forces a massive amount of fluid, nearly 180 liters a day, out of the capillaries and into the waiting cup of Bowman's capsule. But as we know, a human being does not produce 180 liters of urine. If we did, we would have to drink a bathtub full of water every few hours just to stay alive. And our precious supplies of glucose and salt would be depleted in minutes. Tonight, we explore the essential second act of the kidney's work, tubular reabsorption. This is the process of reclamation. It is the phase where the kidney, acting like a discerning collector, sorts through the big dump of filtrate and identifies every molecule of value to be returned to the bloodstream. It is a massive, energetic undertaking that requires sophisticated cellular machinery and a significant portion of your body's daily energy. As we follow the filtrate into the winding corridors of the proximal convoluted tubule, I want you to visualize a bustling assembly line where millions of tiny pumps are working tirelessly to pull life-sustaining treasures back from the brink of excretion. This is where the raw material of filtrate begins its transformation into the refined product of urine. Tubular reabsorption is the movement of water and solutes from the fluid inside the renal tubule back into the blood of the peritubular capillaries. While filtration was a passive pressure-driven event, reabsorption is a highly selective and often active process. It begins the moment the filtrate enters the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT. The PCT is the heavy lifter of the nephron. It is responsible for reabsorbing approximately 65% of the water and sodium, and 100% of the organic nutrients like glucose and amino acids. To understand how this works, we must look at the cells lining the tubule. These cells are built for transport. Their surface facing the filtrate is covered in microvilli, tiny finger-like projections that create a brush border. This design dramatically increases the surface area available for absorption, much like a plush towel absorbs more water than a flat sheet of fabric. Within these cells, the most important worker is the sodium-potassium pump. This pump uses energy in the form of ATP to constantly push sodium ions out of the tubule cell and into the space surrounding the blood vessels. By pushing sodium out, the cell creates a void, or a low concentration of sodium inside itself. Because nature abhors a vacuum, sodium ions from the filtrate naturally want to rush into the cell to fill that space. This movement of sodium is the engine that powers almost everything else. As sodium moves, it often acts as a hitchhiker's vehicle for other substances. Through a process called secondary active transport, glucose and amino acids grab onto the sodium as it enters the cell. They are essentially co-transported, using the kinetic energy of the sodium flow to get a free ride back toward the blood. Water, ever the faithful companion, follows the movement of these solutes through a process called osmosis. As the salts and nutrients move out of the tubule, the fluid left behind becomes more watery or dilute, while the space outside becomes saltier. This creates an osmotic gradient that pulls water through specialized channels called aquaporins. Think of aquaporins as dedicated water-only doors that allow the kidney to reclaim gallons of fluid every hour without spending extra energy. By the time the filtrate leaves the proximal tubule, it has been significantly reduced in volume. But its treasures, the sugar, the proteins, and the bulk of its salt, have been safely returned to the circulation. The history of our understanding of reabsorption is a journey into the heart of cellular biology. In the early 20th century, scientists like Arthur Richards used microscopic glass needles to pull tiny samples of fluid from different parts of a living frog's nephron. By comparing the chemistry of the fluid at the start of the tubule to the fluid at the end, he proved that the tubule was actively changing the composition of the filtrate. This shattered the old idea that the kidney was just a passive filter. We now know that the kidney is one of the most metabolically expensive organs in the body, second only to the heart, in terms of oxygen consumption per gram of tissue. Almost all of that oxygen is used to produce the ATP required to run the sodium pumps we discussed. One of the most fascinating aspects of reabsorption is the concept of the transport maximum, or TM. Because reabsorption relies on specific carrier proteins, those doors and pumps in the cell membrane, there is a limit to how much of any one substance can be moved at once. Imagine a revolving door at a busy hotel. It can only let a certain number of people through per minute. If 1,000 people arrive at once, the door reaches its capacity, and the extra people are left waiting outside. This T sub m is the reason why the kidney has a renal threshold for substances like glucose. For a healthy individual, the transport maximum for glucose is quite high, about 375 milligrams per minute. Under normal conditions, your blood sugar is well below this level, so every single molecule of glucose is caught and reabsorbed. However, in conditions like untreated diabetes mellitus, the concentration of glucose in the filtrate becomes so high that it saturates the carrier proteins. The revolving doors are full, and the excess glucose has nowhere to go but down the tubule and out into the urine. This is why sweet urine was historically used as a diagnostic sign for diabetes. It represents a system where the recollection process has been completely overwhelmed by sheer volume. It is also important to consider the role of solvent drag. As water rushes out of the tubule to follow the sodium, it creates a gentle current that pulls other dissolved minerals along with it, such as potassium, magnesium, and calcium. This allows the kidney to reclaim a variety of essential ions passively, simply by harnessing the flow of water. This intricate interplay between active pumping and passive following is what makes the nephron so efficient. It uses a single energy-intensive step, the sodium pump, to trigger a cascade of secondary movements that reclaim the vast majority of the body's resources. As the filtrate continues its journey past the proximal tubule, it enters the loop of Henle. Here, reabsorption becomes even more specialized. The descending limb is highly permeable to water, but not to salt, while the ascending limb is the exact opposite. It pumps out salt, but is completely waterproof. This division of labor allows the kidney to create a highly concentrated environment in the medulla, which we will explore in later lessons. For now, simply appreciate that the recollection is not a single event, but a series of carefully timed handoffs, ensuring that by the time the fluid reaches the end of the line, nothing of value has been wasted. The mechanics of tubular reabsorption are not just found in textbooks. They are the reason many of our modern medicines work. Consider the class of drugs known as diuretics, often colloquially called water pills. Many of these medications, such as furosemide, work by specifically blocking the sodium pumps in the loop of Henle or the distal tubule. By preventing the kidney from reabsorbing sodium, the drug ensures that the sodium stays in the tubule. Because water always follows salt, the water also stays in the tubule and is eventually excreted as urine. This reduces the total volume of blood in the body, which in turn lowers blood pressure and reduces the workload on a struggling heart. This process also explains why we feel so thirsty after a day of heavy sweating or eating salty foods. When you lose water through sweat, your blood becomes more concentrated. Your kidneys sense this and ramp up their reabsorption efforts, particularly under the influence of hormones like aldosterone, in which tells the tubules to pump harder to bring more sodium and water back into the blood. The result is that you produce a very small amount of highly concentrated urine as your body desperately tries to hold on to its internal C. Furthermore, the high energy demand of the PCT makes it particularly sensitive to a lack of oxygen or the presence of certain toxins. If the blood supply to the kidney is interrupted, a condition called ischemia, the sodium pumps are the first things to fail. Without the pumps, reabsorption stops, and the body begins to lose vital nutrients and water rapidly. This is why maintaining healthy blood flow and blood pressure is not just about the heart. It is about providing the fuel necessary for the kidneys to perform their reclamation work. As you rest tonight, try to visualize this constant, Our silent harvest. Within your cortex, those millions of brush border cells are reaching out into the filtrate, catching every molecule of sugar, every ion of salt, and every drop of water that you need to stay alive. It is a process of extreme diligence. Your body does not take its resources for granted. It assumes everything is valuable until proven otherwise. The logic of reabsorption is the logic of survival. It is the art of reclaiming the best of ourselves before we let the rest go. We have now seen the big dump of filtration and the great harvest of reabsorption. We have followed the treasure as it is pulled back into the safety of the peritubular capillaries. But the story of the tubule is not yet complete. While we have been busy pulling the good things out of the filtrate, the body also uses this winding path to throw a few more bad things in. Sometimes, the initial filtration isn't enough to get rid of certain large toxins, metabolic acids, or drugs. For these stubborn substances, the kidney has a final sweep mechanism. It doesn't wait for them to be filtered at the start. It actively pumps them from the blood directly into the tubule near the end of the line. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. Having now grasped how we save what we need, we are perfectly prepared to see how we discard what remains. Our next lesson will explore the counterpart to reabsorption, tubular secretion. We will see how the kidney fine-tunes the blood's APH and clears out the last remnants of waste to ensure the final product is exactly what the body intended. Lesson 6. Tubular secretion. By now we have followed the odyssey of your blood's essence through two major stages of refinement. We have watched the high-pressure surge of filtration at the gateway of the nephron, and we have marveled at the diligent reclamation of resources during reabsorption. However, the kidney is a perfectionist. It understands that a big dump at the beginning and a great harvest in the middle might still leave behind certain unwanted guests in the bloodstream. This brings us to the third vital process of urine formation, tubular secretion. If filtration is the initial sorting of a cluttered room, and reabsorption is the act of picking your valuables back up off the floor, then secretion is the final sweep. It is the process by which the body identifies specific substances still lingering in the blood and actively pumps them into the renal tubule to be discarded. This is the stage of fine-tuning, where the body makes its most precise adjustments to its internal chemistry. Tonight we will explore how the kidney uses this mechanism to rid itself of hidden toxins, balance its delicate acidity, and manage the levels of electrolytes that keep your heart beating in a steady, rhythmic pace. It is a lesson in the power of active selection. The body's final opportunity to ensure that what stays inside is pure, and what leaves is precisely what is no longer needed. Tubular secretion is essentially the opposite of reabsorption. While reabsorption moves substances from the tubule back into the blood, secretion moves them from the peritubular capillaries directly through the tubule cells and into the filtrate. This process occurs primarily in the proximal convoluted tubule, though it continues with great importance in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. One of the most critical aspects of secretion is that it is almost entirely an active process, because the body is often trying to move substances against their concentration gradient, essentially pushing more of a waste product into a tube that already contains a high concentration of it. It must spend energy. The cells of the tubule use ATP to power molecular pumps that act like bouncers at a club, identifying specific molecules in the blood and forcibly escorting them into the tubule. There are three primary categories of substances that the kidney chooses to secrete. The first includes disposable metabolic wastes that were not filtered in sufficient quantities at the glomerulus. The most notable of these is urea, which we have encountered before, and uric acid. While some of these are filtered at the start, secretion ensures that their levels in the blood remain safely low. The second category involves exogenous substances, or things that come from outside the body. This is the primary way your body clears out many medications, such as penicillin, as well as various food additives and pollutants. If you have ever wondered why certain medicines only stay in your system for a few hours, it is because the pumps in your renal tubules are working overtime to recognize these foreign molecules and secrete them into the urine. The third and perhaps most vital category involves the regulation of electrolytes and pH. The kidney actively secretes potassium ions and hydrogen ions. The secretion of potassium is a tightly controlled process. Because potassium levels in the blood must stay within a very narrow range to prevent heart arrhythmias, the kidney uses secretion as a pressure valve. If potassium levels rise even slightly, the tubule pumps ramp up their activity to flush the excess away. Similarly, by secreting hydrogen ions, the kidney directly manages the acidity of your blood, a process of chemical housekeeping that is essential for every enzyme and cell in your body to function. To truly appreciate the elegance of secretion, we must look at the work of the early 20th century physiologist E.K. Marshall. In the 1920s, there was a great debate in the scientific community about whether the kidney actually secreted anything at all. Many believed it was purely a filter. Marshall performed a famous experiment using the glomerular toadfish, a unique creature whose kidneys have no glomeruli, meaning they cannot filter blood at all. He discovered that these fish still produced urine, proving that the tubules were capable of pulling waste directly from the blood. This was the definitive proof that secretion was a distinct and powerful biological force. The mechanics of hydrogen ion secretion are particularly fascinating. This process is the kidney's way of performing a long-term correction of the blood's pH. So when your blood becomes too acidic, the cells of the tubule actually manufacture new bicarbonate ions, which act as a buffer, and pull them into the blood, while simultaneously pumping hydrogen ions out into the filtrate. This often involves a swap mechanism. For every positively charged hydrogen ion the cell secretes into the urine, it reabsorbs a positively charged sodium ion back into the blood. This ensures that the electrical balance of the body remains stable, even as the chemical balance is shifted. Another layer of this process is the role of the hormone aldosterone. Secreted by the adrenal glands, aldosterone is the master commander of the distal tubule. When aldosterone levels are high, it signals the tubule cells to build more sodium-potassium pumps. This causes the body to reabsorb more sodium and the water that follows it, while simultaneously secreting more potassium into the urine. It is a dual-action signal that balances blood pressure and electrolyte concentration at the same time. This highlights how the kidney is not just a self-contained unit, but is part of a grand coordinated symphony of hormones and signals. We must also consider the finality of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. While the proximal tubule does much of the heavy lifting, the secretion that happens later in the line is where the body makes its last-minute decisions. By the time the filtrate reaches these final sections, most of the water and nutrients have been saved. This makes the concentration of the remaining wastes much higher, allowing the secretion pumps to be incredibly specific. It is here that the body decides exactly how acidic your urine will be and exactly how much potassium you can afford to lose. It is the final checkpoint before the fluid is committed to the renal pelvis and eventually the outside world. The reality of tubular secretion is something we encounter every time we interact with modern medicine. For example, doctors often have to be very careful when prescribing multiple medications to a patient because many drugs compete for the same secretion pumps in the kidney. If two drugs are both trying to get through the same molecular door at the same time, they can back each other up, leading to a dangerous accumulation of medicine in the blood. This is known as a drug-drug interaction, and it is a direct consequence of the limited capacity of our renal secretion system. The secretion of hydrogen ions also explains why our diet and exercise habits affect the chemistry of our urine. If you engage in intense exercise, your muscles produce lactic acid. To compensate for this sudden spike in acidity, your kidneys will dramatically increase the secretion of hydrogen ions. This is why, after a period of heavy exertion, your urine may become significantly more acidic. The kidney is working behind the scenes to clean up the metabolic aftermath of your activity, ensuring that your blood pH returns to its ideal, slightly alkaline state as quickly as possible. Furthermore, the vital role of potassium secretion is why kidney health is so closely linked to heart health. In patients with advanced kidney disease, the pumps for potassium secretion often begin to fail. This leads to a condition called hyperkalemia, or high blood potassium. Because potassium is the electrical trigger for muscle contraction, even a small excess in the blood can disrupt the electrical signals in the heart, leading to life-threatening rhythm changes. This is why one of the most important goals of renal therapy is to support the kidney's ability to continue this final sweep of electrolytes. As you rest tonight, try to visualize this final stage of refinement. Within the dark, quiet corridors of your nephrons, the bouncers are at work. They are scanning your blood for the last traces of acidity, the excess potassium from your dinner, and the metabolites of any medicine you may have taken. They are ensuring that your internal environment remains a sanctuary of balance. The logic of secretion is the logic of precision. It is the body's way of saying that while most things can be handled in bulk, the most important adjustments must be made one molecule at a time. We have now followed the fluid through the three great movements of the renal symphony: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. We have seen how the blood is opened up, how its treasures are reclaimed, and how its hidden wastes are finally discarded. The recipe for your urine is now essentially complete. However, there is one final, critical variable that we have not yet fully explored. That variable is concentration. Depending on whether you have spent your day drinking plenty of water or walking through a dry heat, the body must decide how watery or salty the final urine should be. This decision determines whether you produce a large volume of dilute fluid or a tiny amount of concentrated liquid to save your life. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. Having now grasped how the chemical content of urine is decided, we are perfectly prepared to see how its volume and density are managed. Our next lesson will dive into the physics of the medulla to explore the regulation of urine concentration and volume. We will look at the hormones and the multiplier systems that allow us to survive in a world where water is not always guaranteed. Lesson 7. Regulation of urine, concentration, and volume. In our journey so far, we have witnessed the kidney's remarkable ability to filter the blood, reclaim vital nutrients, and actively discard specific wastes. We have the chemical recipe of urine largely established. However, there is one final sophisticated challenge the body must meet: the challenge of water conservation. We live in a world where our access to water is constantly changing. Some days we drink in abundance, other days we find ourselves in dry, arid environments where every drop of internal fluid is precious. Tonight we explore how the kidney acts as a master regulator of volume. We are going to look at the physics of the renal medulla and the hormonal signals that determine whether your urine is a clear, copious stream or a dark, concentrated essence. Now, this is a lesson in the counter-current multiplier system, a brilliant bit of biological engineering that allows us to produce urine that is significantly more concentrated than our own blood, a feat that is essential for life on land. As we delve into the loops and ducts of the nephron, I want you to visualize a delicate dance of salt and water, a rhythmic exchange that ensures your internal sea remains at the perfect level, no matter the tides of the world outside. To understand how we regulate the concentration of urine, we must return to the loop of Henle and the collecting ducts. In our previous lessons, we noted that these structures dive deep into the renal medulla, the inner portion of the kidney. The medulla is not a uniform environment. It is a landscape of increasing saltiness. As you move from the cortex toward the center of the kidney, the concentration of solutes, the osmolality of the surrounding fluid increases dramatically. This salinity gradient is the engine that drives water regulation. The first part of this engine is the counter-current multiplier, which takes place in the loop of Henle. The loop consists of two limbs with very different properties. The descending limb is relatively thin and is highly permeable to water, but it is almost completely impermeable to salt. As the filtrate travels down this limb, it enters the increasingly salty environment of the medulla. Because nature seeks balance, the water inside the tube is pulled out into the salty space around it through osmosis. This makes the fluid remaining inside the loop more and more concentrated as it reaches the bottom of the U-turn. The ascending limb of the loop is the exact opposite. It is thick-walled and completely waterproof. However, it is lined with powerful active transport pumps that throw sodium and chloride out of the tubule and into the surrounding medullary fluid. Because water cannot follow the salt out of this limb, the fluid inside the tube becomes increasingly dilute as it climbs back toward the cortex. But here is the genius of the design. By pumping salt out on the way up, the ascending limb is creating the very saltiness that pulls the water out of the descending limb on the way down. This is why it is called a multiplier. The two limbs work together to create a concentration gradient that is much stronger than a single tube could ever achieve. Once the fluid leaves the loop, it enters the collecting duct. This is the final decision point for the body's water balance. While the loop of Henle creates the salty gradient, the collecting duct uses it. The walls of the collecting duct are usually impermeable to water, meaning that if left to its own devices, the dilute fluid would simply pass through and be excreted as large amounts of watery urine. However, the body has a chemical messenger called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which is released by the posterior pituitary gland when you are dehydrated. A DH acts like a master key. When it reaches the cells of the collecting duct, it triggers the insertion of specialized water channels called aquaporins into the cell membranes. Suddenly, the gates are open. As the dilute fluid travels down the collecting duct through the salty medulla, the aquaporins allow the surrounding saltiness to pull the water out of the urine and back into the body. The more ADH is present, the more water is saved, and the more concentrated the final urine becomes. The discovery of the countercurrent mechanism is one of the great triumphs of 20th century physiology. For many years, scientists were baffled by how the kidney could produce urine that was 4 times more concentrated than blood. In the 1940s and 50s, a Swiss chemist named Werner Kuhn proposed that the loop of Henle functioned as a countercurrent multiplier, drawing inspiration from industrial heat exchangers used in engineering. It was a revolutionary idea because it suggested that the shape of the organ was just as important as the chemistry of its cells. And his theory was eventually proven by measuring the saltiness of the medulla at different depths, confirming that the kidneys create a salty core to act as a magnet for water. However, creating a salty gradient is only half the battle. The body must also maintain it. If blood were to flow through the medulla in a normal way, it would simply wash away the salt, destroying the gradient. To prevent this, the kidney has a specialized network of capillaries called the vasa recta. These vessels are long, straight hairpins that run parallel to the loop of Henle. Because they follow the same U-turn path, they act as countercurrent exchangers. As blood flows down into the salty medulla, it picks up salt and loses water. But as it turns the corner and flows back up toward the cortex, it loses the salt and picks the water back up. This ensures that the blood delivers oxygen and nutrients to the medullary cells without carrying away the precious salt needed for the concentration gradient. It is a system of passive exchange that protects the hard work of the nephron loops. We must also consider the role of urea in this process. While we often think of urea simply as a waste product, the kidney actually recycles some of it in the medulla. In the presence of ADH, the lower part of the collecting duct becomes permeable to urea, allowing it to leak out into the deep medulla. This urea adds even more to the osmolality of the region, contributing nearly half of the pulling power that helps us conserve water. This urea cycling is a perfect example of biological efficiency, using a waste product to help perform a vital, life-saving function. When you are fully hydrated, perhaps after a large glass of water, the brain's osmoreceptors detect that the blood is becoming too dilute. They signal the pituitary gland to stop releasing ADH. Without the master key, the aquaporins are removed from the collecting duct walls. The water is trapped inside the tube, and it flows out as dilute, pale urine. This is the body's way of offloading excess volume to prevent your blood pressure from rising too high. This constant rhythmic adjustment of ADH levels is what keeps your internal fluid volume within a very narrow, healthy range. The regulation of urine concentration explains many of our common physiological experiences. For example, consider the effect of alcohol. Alcohol is a well-known diuretic because it directly inhibits the release of ADH from the pituitary gland. Without ADH, your collecting ducts remain closed to water reabsorption. Even if you are already dehydrated, your kidneys will continue to lose water, leading to the frequent urination and the subsequent dehydration headache associated with a hangover. You are essentially forcing your kidneys to ignore the salty gradient of the medulla. Similarly, the drug caffeine acts as a mild diuretic, but through a different mechanism. It tends to increase the blood flow to the kidneys and can interfere with the reabsorption of sodium in the tubules. When sodium stays in the tubule, water stays with it, increasing the volume of urine. These everyday substances illustrate just how sensitive our water balance system is to chemical signals. There is also a medical condition known as diabetes insipidus, which is entirely different from the sugar diabetes we discussed earlier. In this condition, either the brain fails to produce ADH or the kidneys fail to respond to it. As a result, the person cannot concentrate their urine and may produce up to 20 liters of very dilute urine a day. This highlights just how vital that tiny hormone and those microscopic aquaporins are to our survival. Without the ability to use the medullary gradient, we would be tethered to a water source every hour of our lives. Image showing the difference between dilute and concentrated urine formation. As you rest tonight, take a moment to appreciate this elegant physics. Within your kidneys, millions of loops are multiplying salt, and millions of capillaries are exchanging fluid to protect that salt. Your brain is constantly monitoring the saltiness of your blood and adjusting the flow of ADH accordingly. It is a silent, automated system that ensures you stay hydrated while you sleep. The logic of concentration is the logic of thrift. It is the body's way of making sure that when water is scarce, it is cherished, and when it is plenty, it is shared. We have now explored the deep, salty mysteries of the renal medulla and the hormonal master switches that govern our water balance. We have followed the fluid until it has become true, final urine, refined, filtered, and precisely concentrated. But once the urine leaves the collecting duct, its journey through the nephron is over. It now enters the plumbing of the body. It must be gathered from those millions of ducts and transported safely to a place where it can be stored until you are ready to release it. The high-pressure world of chemistry and physics now gives way to the world of muscular transport and elastic storage. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. Having now grasped how the volume of urine is decided, we are perfectly prepared to see how it is moved and held. Our next lesson will follow the fluid into the ureters and the urinary bladder. We will look at the rhythmic contractions that move urine against gravity and the remarkable anatomy of the bladder wall that allows it to stretch without breaking. Lesson 8. Ureters and the urinary bladder. We have spent much of our journey together in the microscopic realm, marveling at the high-pressure filters and the winding chemical laboratories of the nephron. But once the collecting ducts have performed their final adjustments, once the antidiuretic hormone has had its say, and the water has been precisely balanced, the fluid we now call urine must leave the kidney. It transitions from a world of molecular exchange to a world of mechanical transport and sophisticated storage. Tonight, we follow this fluid as it exits the renal pelvis and enters the grand plumbing of the human body. We will explore the ureters, the slender muscular conduits that bridge the gap between the kidneys and the lower abdomen. Then, we will dwell upon the urinary bladder, a remarkable organ that serves as a resilient, expandable reservoir. This is a study of macroanatomy and smooth muscle dynamics. It is here that the body solves the problem of how to move fluid against the forces of gravity and how to store that fluid without allowing pressure to back up into the delicate filters we have already studied. As we examine these structures, I want you to visualize the quiet, rhythmic pulses that move urine forward and the elegant, elastic walls that hold it in place. We are moving from the chemistry of life to the architecture of containment. The journey of urine from the kidney to the outside world begins in the ureters. These are two slender tubes, roughly 10 to 12 inches in length, that descend from the renal pelvis of each kidney to the posterior base of the urinary bladder. Many people assume that urine simply falls into the bladder due to gravity. But the body is far more proactive than that. Each ureter is a living muscular pump. If we were to look at a cross-section of a ureter, we would see 3 distinct layers of tissue. The innermost layer is the mucosa, lined with a very special type of tissue called transitional epithelium. This tissue is unique to the urinary system. Its cells can slide over one another, changing shape from plump and round to flat and thin as the tube stretches. The middle layer is the muscularis, composed of 2 layers of smooth muscle. This is where the magic happens. These muscles engage in peristalsis, the same rhythmic, wave-like contractions found in your digestive tract. Every few seconds, a wave of contraction begins at the renal pelvis and milks the urine down the length of the tube. This ensures that urine continues to flow towards the bladder, even if you are lying down or sleeping. The outermost layer is the adventitia, a fibrous connective tissue that anchors the ureters to the surrounding abdominal wall. As the ureters reach the bladder, they do not simply plug into the top. Instead, they enter the bladder through its posterior wall at an oblique angle. This is a brilliant bit of biological engineering. Because they enter at a slant, as the bladder fills with urine and its internal pressure rises, the walls of the bladder naturally press against the ureters, pinching them shut. This creates a physiological valve that prevents the backflow of urine into the kidneys. Without this angled entry, not every time your bladder became full, the pressure would push urine back up toward the nephrons, causing catastrophic damage to those delicate structures. This leads us to the urinary bladder. The bladder is a hollow, distensible muscular organ situated in the pelvic cavity, just posterior to the pubic symphysis. In males, it sits directly in front of the rectum. In females, it is positioned anterior to the vagina and inferior to the uterus. When empty, the bladder collapses into a small triangular shape. But as it fills, it expands upward into the abdominal cavity, becoming pear-shaped. The interior of the bladder features a smooth, triangular region at its base called the trigon. The 2 ureters enter at the top corners of this triangle, and the urethra exits at the bottom. This area is clinically significant because the trigon is very smooth and lacks the folds found in the rest of the bladder, making it a common site for persistent infections. The rest of the bladder wall is thick and composed of 3 layers of smooth muscle, collectively known as the detrusor muscle. Surrounding the exit to the urethra is the internal urethral sphincter, an involuntary muscle that stays tightly closed until the body is ready for release. The history of our understanding of the bladder's elasticity is a story of form following function. In the early days of anatomy, observers were fascinated by how an organ could change its volume so dramatically without tearing. It wasn't until the development of the high-powered microscope that scientists identified the transitional epithelium, also known as urothelium. When the bladder is empty, this lining looks thick and multi-layered, almost like a stack of pillows. But as the bladder fills, these cells unfold and stretch until the lining appears to be only 2 or 3 cells thick. This transition allows the bladder to increase its surface area without putting undue stress on the individual cells. The detrusor muscle is equally fascinating. Unlike the muscles in your arm, which are arranged in neat parallel bundles, the detrusor muscle fibers are woven together in a complex, multi-directional mesh. This net-like arrangement is what allows the bladder to expand in all directions simultaneously while maintaining the structural integrity needed to eventually contract and expel the urine. This muscular architecture was studied extensively by the 19th century French physician Félix Goujon, who realized that the bladder was not just a passive bag, but a sophisticated pressure-sensing organ. As the bladder fills, it undergoes a process called stress relaxation. Usually, when you stretch a muscle, its tension increases. However, the smooth muscle of the bladder has the unique ability to stretch and then relax at its new length. This allows the bladder to hold increasing amounts of urine, up to 500 milliliters or more, without a significant rise in internal pressure. This is vital for the safety of the entire system. If the bladder pressure rose too quickly, it would overcome the valves at the ureters and back up into the kidneys. The detrusor muscle's ability to yield to the incoming fluid is what protects your upper urinary tract from the pressures of the lower tract. We should also consider the external urethral sphincter, which sits just below the internal one. While the internal sphincter is part of the involuntary detrusor muscle, the external sphincter is made of skeletal muscle. This is the part of the anatomy that connects the urinary system to the nervous system's conscious control. It is the final gatekeeper. The coordination between the stretching signals from the bladder wall and the holding signals from the external sphincter is a complex neurological dance involving the spinal cord and the brain, a process we will explore in our next lesson. For now, simply appreciate the physical structures that make this control possible. The anatomy of the ureters and bladder explains many common medical experiences. For example, consider the intense pain of a kidney stone. These stones often form in the renal pelvis and then try to travel down the ureter. Because the ureter is so narrow and its walls are so muscular, when a stone gets lodged, the ureter begins to contract violently in an attempt to push it through. This causes a wave of intense colicky pain that radiates from the back to the groin. This is the sound of the ureter's peristaltic pumps working against an immovable object. Furthermore, the one-way valve, created by the angled entry of the ureters, is the body's primary defense against urinary tract infections, UTIs. Bacteria often enter through the urethra and colonize the bladder, a condition called cystitis. As long as the physiological valves at the ureteric openings are working correctly, the infection is trapped in the bladder, where it can be treated. However, if those valves are weak, a condition sometimes seen in children called vesicoureteral reflux, the bacteria can swim upstream into the kidneys, leading to a much more serious infection called pyelonephritis. This illustrates how the macroanatomy we are discussing tonight is the first line of defense for the microscopic chemistry we discussed earlier. The resilience of the bladder also changes as we age. In infants, the bladder is actually situated higher in the abdomen and is almost entirely an abdominal organ. As we grow, it descends into the true pelvis. In a later life, the elasticity of the detrusor muscle or the strength of the sphincters may change, leading to issues with storage or control. But even then, the fundamental design remains: a system of active transport and elastic storage. As you rest tonight, you try to visualize this quiet, rhythmic movement. Within you, those two slender ureters are milking the fluid downward, drop by drop. Your bladder is slowly, gently expanding, its transitional cells unfolding like the petals of a flower to accommodate the day's final work. It is a process of incredible patience. Your body is holding its ground, storing its waste securely, and protecting the delicate filters above from the pressure below. The logic of storage is the logic of protection. It is the art of holding on until the moment is right to let go. We have now seen the fluid move from the kidneys, down the long corridors of the ureters, and into the reservoir of the bladder. We have explored the muscular pumps and the elastic walls that make this journey safe and efficient. The urine is now gathered, refined, and stored. But a reservoir cannot hold its contents forever. Eventually, the capacity of the bladder will be reached, and the body must receive a signal that it is time to empty. This is not just a simple matter of opening the tap. It is a complex interaction of sensory nerves, spinal reflexes, and conscious brain centers. It is the moment where biology meets behavior. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. Having now grasped how the urine is transported and stored, we are perfectly prepared to see how it is finally released. Our next lesson will explore the Micturition reflex. We will look at the stretch receptors that act as the bladder's alarm system and the neurological handshake between the involuntary and voluntary muscles that allows us to control our world. Lesson 9. Micturition, the urination reflex. We have now followed the course of the fluid from its high-pressure berth in the glomerulus through the long, winding chemical laboratories of the nephron and down into the elastic storage chamber of the bladder. The urine is gathered, refined, and precisely balanced. But a reservoir, by its very nature, is a temporary solution. Eventually, the body must transition from the silent work of storage to the active process of release. This process is known as micturition, a word derived from the Latin micturare, meaning to desire to urinate. Tonight, we explore the fascinating intersection of the autonomic and somatic nervous systems. Micturition is not merely a mechanical opening of the tap. It is a sophisticated dialogue between your bladder and your brain, a series of sensory signals, your spinal reflexes, and conscious decisions that allow you to maintain control over your internal environment. It is the moment where the involuntary rhythms of your organs meet the voluntary choices of your mind. As we examine the stretch receptors, the spinal arcs, and the specialized centers in the brain, I want you to visualize this as a graceful, neurological handshake. It is the final coordination of the urinary system, ensuring that the process of elimination is as orderly and controlled as the process of filtration. To understand the Micturition reflex, we must first look at the sensory equipment of the bladder. Within the thick, mesh-like walls of the detrusor muscle, there are millions of specialized nerve endings called stretch receptors. As the bladder fills and its walls expand, these receptors are physically pulled, and like the strings of a musical instrument, they begin to fire electrical signals that travel along sensory fibers to the sacral region of your spinal cord. Under normal circumstances, when the bladder holds a small amount of urine, perhaps less than 150 milliliters, the signals are quiet and infrequent. But as the volume increases toward 200 to 300 milliliters, the tension on these receptors reaches a critical threshold. The frequency of the signals increases, and the spinal cord initiates the Micturition reflex. This is an autonomic involuntary loop. The spinal cord sends parasympathetic signals back down to the bladder, telling the detrusor muscle to begin rhythmic, gentle contractions and signaling the internal urethral sphincter, that ring of smooth muscle at the bladder's exit, to relax and open. However, if this reflex were purely automatic, we would have no more control over our lives than an infant does. This is where the external urethral sphincter comes into play. Unlike the internal sphincter, which is made of involuntary smooth muscle, the external sphincter is composed of skeletal muscle. This means it is under the jurisdiction of the somatic nervous system, the part of you that controls your arms and legs. Even while the spinal cord is reflexively telling the bladder to contract, your brain is receiving a fullness signal. If the time and place are not appropriate, the brain sends a continuous stream of inhibitory signals down the spinal cord to keep the external sphincter tightly shut. This creates a state of controlled tension. The bladder wants to empty, the internal gate is open, but the external gate remains barred. And it is only when you consciously decide to relax the muscles of the pelvic floor and the external sphincter that the handshake is completed, and the urine is allowed to flow. This dual gate system, one involuntary and one voluntary, is the hallmark of human continence. The history of our understanding of this reflex is deeply tied to the study of neurology. In the early 20th century, researchers began to realize that the urge to go wasn't just coming from the bladder itself, but from specific command centers in the brain. The most important of these is located in the brain stem and is known as the Pontine Micturition Center, or PMC. Think of the PMC as the dispatcher for the urinary system. It receives inputs from the bladder, the spinal cord, and the higher thinking areas of the cerebral cortex. And when the bladder signals that it is full, the PMC acts as a coordinator. If the cerebral cortex, the thinking brain, gives the green light, the PMC coordinates the complex sequence of events. It amplifies the parasympathetic signals to contract the bladder and simultaneously inhibits the motor nerves that keep the external sphincter closed. This ensures that the two events happen in perfect synchrony. If the bladder were to contract against a closed sphincter, the pressure could cause significant pain and damage. The PMC ensures a smooth, low-pressure exit for the fluid. There is also a fascinating developmental aspect to this reflex. In newborns and infants, the higher brain centers have not yet established their veto power over the spinal reflex. When an infant's bladder reaches a certain level of stretch, the spinal cord simply executes the Micturition reflex immediately. Potty training is essentially the process of the brain learning to communicate with the sacral spinal cord, training the cerebral cortex to override the involuntary reflex until a suitable time is found. This requires the development of specific neural pathways that can suppress the PMC's activity. We should also consider the role of the sympathetic nervous system in this process. While the parasympathetic system is the go signal for urination, the sympathetic system is the stop or store signal. During the filling phase, sympathetic nerves release norepinephrine, which tells the detrusor muscle to stay relaxed and the internal sphincter to stay tightly closed. This ensures that even during times of stress or activity, the fight or flight response, the bladder remains in a storage mode. It is only when we are in a rest and digest state that the parasympathetic system takes the lead. This balance between sympathetic storage and parasympathetic release is a perfect example of the body's constant push and pull toward equilibrium. As the act of micturition begins, the body employs a few auxiliary maneuvers. Often, we subconsciously increase our intra-abdominal pressure by contracting our diaphragm and abdominal muscles, a maneuver known as the Valsalva maneuver. This squeezes the bladder from the outside, aiding the detrusor muscle in expelling the urine. Simultaneously, the muscles of the pelvic floor relax, lowering the bladder and straightening the path through the urethra. And every part of your lower torso participates in this coordinated effort to ensure the bladder is emptied completely, preventing the stagnant urine that could lead to bacterial growth. The complex neurology of micturition explains why various conditions can disrupt our sense of control. For example, consider the experience of losing your breath or feeling a sudden urge to go when you are frightened. This is because the emotional centers of the brain, such as the amygdala, have direct connections to the pontine micturition center. Intense emotion can sometimes override the inhibitory signals from the cerebral cortex, triggering the reflex prematurely. This is the biological basis for the nervous bladder. Furthermore, understanding the spinal nature of the reflex is crucial for helping those with spinal cord injuries. If a person suffers an injury that severs the connection between the brain and the sacral spinal cord, they may lose voluntary control over the external sphincter. However, the spinal reflex arc itself may remain intact. This can lead to what is called a reflex bladder, where the bladder empties automatically whenever it becomes full, much like it did in infancy. Conversely, if the nerves at the sacral level are damaged, the bladder may lose its ability to contract at all, requiring the use of a catheter to prevent the dangerous buildup of pressure. The logic of the Micturition reflex also explains the common phenomenon of urge incontinence. Sometimes the stretch receptors become hypersensitive, or the detrusor muscle becomes irritable, sending emergency signals to the brain even when the bladder is not truly full. This creates a sudden, overwhelming urge to urinate that can be difficult to ignore. Many modern treatments for this condition involve medications that gently quiet the parasympathetic signals, allowing the bladder to return to its normal, calm storage rhythm. As you rest tonight, try to visualize this constant, silent monitoring. Even as your conscious mind drifts towards sleep, your sacral spinal cord is keeping a low-level watch on the tension in your bladder walls. Your brain is maintaining a steady, quiet inhibitory signal, ensuring that your rest remains undisturbed. It is a masterpiece of vigilance. Your body knows exactly how much it is holding, and it has a plan for exactly when to let it go. The logic of Micturition is the logic of coordination. It is the art of balancing the needs of the organ with the will of the individual. We have now followed the fluid through every phase of its creation, storage, and release. We have seen the chemical refinement in the nephron, the rhythmic transport in the ureters, and the neurological handshake of Micturition. The cycle of the urinary system is nearly complete. But to truly understand the value of this system, we must look at the final product itself. Urine is not just wastewater, it is a detailed record of your metabolic health. By looking at the color, the clarity, and the chemical composition of the urine, we can read the story of what is happening deep within your tissues. It is the final report card of the master chemists we have been studying. Let's hold that thought here, a complete piece of the puzzle. Having now grasped the mechanics of how the urine leaves the body, we are perfectly prepared to see what it tells us about the body it left behind. Our final lesson will explore the characteristics and composition of urine. We will look at the pigments, the solutes, and the uroscopy of the past and present to see how this fluid serves as a window into our inner world. Lesson 10. Characteristics and composition of urine. We have reached the final stage of our journey through the urinary system. We have witnessed the high-pressure filtration at the glomerulus, the energetic reclamation of treasures in the proximal tubule, the deep, salty mysteries of the medulla, and the neurological coordination of the bladder. The fluid has been through a rigorous process of refinement, and now it stands as the final product, urine. It is the end result of the kidney's tireless work as a master chemist. In this final lesson, we are going to look at the characteristics and composition of this fluid. While it is often dismissed simply as waste, urine is actually a profound biological record. It is a window into the state of your internal sea. Every drop tells a story about your hydration, your diet, your metabolic rate, and even the health of your distant organs. We will explore the pigments that give it color, the specific solutes that signify a healthy metabolism, and the red flags that tell a physician when the body's balance has been disrupted. As we conclude our course, I want you to visualize this fluid not as something to be discarded without thought, but as a final report card, a testament to the precision and care with which your body maintains its stability while you sleep. To understand the nature of urine, we must first look at its general physical characteristics. In a healthy individual, urine is typically a clear, pale yellow to deep amber liquid. It is composed of approximately 95% water and 5% solutes. This ratio is the reason the kidney is so vital. It must dispose of a specific amount of trash every day, but it must do so while using the least amount of water possible to prevent dehydration. The yellow color of urine comes from a pigment called urochrome. This pigment is a byproduct of the body's destruction of hemoglobin. When old red blood cells are broken down in the liver, they produce bilirubin, which is eventually converted into urochrome. The intensity of this yellow color is a direct reflection of your hydration status. If you have been drinking plenty of water, the urochrome is diluted, resulting in a pale straw color. If you are dehydrated, the kidneys reabsorb as much water as possible, leaving the urochrome concentrated and the urine a deep honey-like amber. The odor of fresh urine is usually slightly aromatic, but if it sits for a while, it develops a distinct ammonia-like smell. This happens because bacteria begin to break down the urea, the primary solute in urine, back into ammonia. However, certain foods can dramatically alter this. Many people notice a distinct scent after eating asparagus, which is caused by the breakdown of asparagosic acid into sulfur-containing compounds. This is a harmless reminder of how quickly the chemicals in our food reach our internal filters. When we look at the 5% that isn't water, we find the metabolic signatures of our existence. The most abundant solute is urea, which is produced by the liver when it breaks down excess amino acids from the proteins you eat. Next is creatinine, a waste product of muscle metabolism. Because muscle breakdown happens at a very steady rate, the amount of creatinine in your urine is remarkably constant in making it a perfect benchmark for measuring kidney health. We also find uric acid, a byproduct of nucleic acid metabolism, and a variety of ions like sodium, potassium, sulfate, and phosphate. These are the excesses of the day, the salts and minerals that your body didn't need to keep in its internal sea. The acidity or pH of urine is another key characteristic. While the blood must stay in a very narrow, slightly alkaline range of 7.4, the urine has a much wider range, typically between 4.5 and 8.0. The average is about 6.0, which is slightly acidic. This variability is the kidney's way of absorbing the blows of your diet. If you eat a diet high in protein and whole grains, your urine will become more acidic to flush out the resulting metabolic acids. If you eat a diet rich in vegetables and fruits, your urine will become more alkaline. The urine takes the hit so that your blood doesn't have to. The study of urine, known as uroscopy, is one of the oldest forms of medical diagnosis. Long before we had blood tests or MRI machines, ancient physicians relied on the wheel of colors to understand their patient's health. In the Middle Ages, doctors would hold a flask of urine, called a matula, up to the light, observing its clarity, sediment, and even its taste. While we now have much more sophisticated tools, the fundamental logic remains the same. The urine is a reflection of the blood. One of the most important measurements we take today is specific gravity. This is a comparison of the weight of urine to the weight of pure distilled water. Because urine contains solutes, it is always heavier than water. Pure water has a specific gravity of 1.000, while healthy urine typically ranges from 1.001 to 1.035. If the specific gravity is very low, it tells us the kidneys are producing very dilute urine, perhaps because of high water intake or a lack of ADH. If it is very high, it tells us the kidneys are working hard to conserve every drop of water. When a modern laboratory performs a urinalysis, they are looking for substances that should not be there. These are the red flags of renal and systemic health. For example, the presence of glucose in the urine, a condition called glycosuria, is a classic sign of diabetes mellitus. As we discussed in earlier lessons, this happens when the blood sugar is so high that it overwhelms the reabsorption pumps in the proximal tubule. Similarly, the presence of proteinuria, often points to damage in the glomerular filtration membrane, allowing large albumin molecules to leak through. We also look for ketones, which are the byproducts of the body burning fat instead of sugar for energy. While this can happen during starvation or very low-carb diets, it can also indicate a dangerous state called diabetic ketoacidosis. The presence of bilirubin or bile pigments can signal liver disease or an obstruction of the bile ducts. Perhaps most importantly, the presence of erythrocytes, red blood cells, or leukocytes, white blood cells, can indicate trauma, kidney stones, or a bacterial infection in the urinary tract. Each of these uninvited guests tells a specific story about where the body's balance has been compromised. The clarity of the urine is also a vital layer of context. Healthy urine should be transparent. If it appears cloudy or turbid, it often suggests the presence of mucin, bacteria, or pus from an infection. Sometimes, cloudiness can be caused by the precipitation of salts, like phosphates or oxalates, which can be the precursors to kidney stones. By simply looking at the fluid, we are seeing the physical result of the chemical environment within the renal pelvis. It is the final synthesis of all the processes we have studied, from the initial big dump of filtration to the final fine-tuning of secretion. The composition of your urine is something you can observe every day to check in on your own health. It is the body's most direct form of feedback. If you wake up and notice your urine is very dark, your kidneys are telling you that you haven't given them enough water to work with. They are working overtime, using the countercurrent multiplier to save your internal C, and they are asking for a refill. It is a simple, elegant communication system. This knowledge also explains why certain lifestyle choices affect us the way they do. For instance, a high-salt diet forces the kidneys to excrete more sodium, which in turn carries more water with it, potentially leading to higher blood pressure and increased thirst. Conversely, the reason we feel better after eating a balanced diet of alkaline ash foods like greens is that we are reducing the acid load on our kidneys, allowing them to maintain our blood pH with less effort. Furthermore, the report card of urine is what allows us to detect diseases long before they show outward symptoms. In many cases of kidney disease, the kidneys continue to function well enough that the person feels fine, but a urinalysis might show the micro leakage of protein that signals the filters are beginning to fray. By catching these chemical changes early, we can often intervene and protect the remaining nephrons. This is the true value of the master chemist. It provides a constant, readable stream of data about our survival. Take a moment to let the logic of this final product find its place. Your urine is not an accident. It is a calculated, deliberate solution. It is the exact amount of water and salt that your body could afford to lose at this specific moment in time. As you rest tonight, your kidneys are continuing this calculation. They are weighing the urea, balancing the potassium and adjusting the urochrome. They are ensuring that when you wake up, your report card is clean and your internal C is fresh. We have reached the end of our curriculum. We have traveled from the macro anatomy of the kidneys and bladder to the microscopic world of the nephron and the molecular dance of filtration and reabsorption. We have seen how the body uses physics, chemistry, and neurology to maintain the delicate balance of life. You now hold a comprehensive understanding of the urinary system. You know that it is not just a disposal unit, but a sophisticated laboratory that guards your pH, your blood pressure, your hydration, and your metabolic purity. The logic of the system is the logic of life itself, a constant cycle of renewal, adjustment, and release. Let's hold these thoughts here. A complete and finished puzzle. You have explored the architecture of your own stability. As you drift into a deep and restful sleep, let the knowledge of these silent, tireless guardians bring you peace. Your master chemists are at their stations, watching over your internal sea while you dream.